Good morning, and welcome to lesson 18 in our study of the book of Judges. We're still doing the story of Samson, and we're going to today cover the last 10 verses of chapter 14. But before we do that, let's just review a bit, because Samson is probably the most enigmatic of all the judges of Israel. He's certainly given the most press, and he's the most famous of all the judges, even though he was anything but obedient to what God had said. If you recall, his birth was somewhat miraculous. It was announced to his mother by an angel. His mother was barren, but the angel announced that she would have a son, and that he would be considered a Nazirite from the day of his birth. A Nazirite, if you recall, back in Numbers chapter 6, it says a Nazirite would be separate to God. He would be someone who would actually voluntarily be separate to God, although in this case, Samson was considered to be one from his birth. But it said, he shall certainly refrain from wine, he shall drink neither wine, vinegar made from wine, or vinegar made from similar drink, neither shall he drink any grape juice, nor eat fresh grapes or raisins. All his days he shall be separate from separation. He shall eat nothing that is produced by the grapevine, nor from seed to the skin. He shall not come upon, no razor shall come upon his head, and he shall be separate for God for his lifetime, or for the period of his Nazirite vow. So this was Samson's supposed upbringing. And it says that in chapter 13, in the first part of chapter 14, that he was really not adherent to this. It says in chapter 13 that the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him at a young age. But it showed also that he was becoming very rebellious and somewhat independent, and not very adherent to what his family or his parents wished. In the first part of this chapter, we see how he fell in love with a girl of the Philistines in a village about 3 miles from where he was born. And even though his parents did not want him to follow through with this, he said, "Get her for me." Samson said to his father, "Get her for me, for she pleases me well." And so they made some trips to Timoth, the small town of the Philistines, just on the border of the Israelite land and the Philistine land. Made a number of trips down there. And on one trip, while walking through the vineyards, a place he was not supposed to be, he encountered a lion whom he killed, the superhuman strength that the Lord obviously gave him. And then on a return journey, he went to the carcass of the lion and found there the bees had made a hive, and he took honey from that carcass and ate it. Now, he was again, due to his Nazirite vow, not supposed to come or deal with any dead body. And again, he broke his vow. You notice it says that he did not, when he came to his father and mother, he gave some of the honey to them, but he did not tell them where he got it, where he had taken it from. So he was breaking his vows. He went near a dead carcass, and he went through a vineyard. It was sort of a strike against him as far as he was concerned. If that was strike 1, now the rest of this chapter shows strike 2. Because he went down, it says in chapter 10, "So his father went down to the woman, and Samson gave a feast there, for young men used to do so. And it happened when they saw him that they brought 30 companions to be with him." So Samson went to this Philistine town and organized a feast, but because he had no real friends there, friends of the bride-to-be, organized the feast and took some companions with them, probably people just they met on the street or people they knew, said, "Look, they're having a feast, there's going to be food, there's going to be probably wine, come on and we'll join us." So these are sort of like rent-a-friends that just came along for the ride. And in fact, when you say there's going to be wine there, the word used for the feast in the Bible was mishteh, M-I-S-H-T-E-H, which means a drinking feast. So this was a feast with alcohol, with wine, with food that was there, and it went on for 7 days. This was sort of the custom in the Philistine culture, to have this feast before or during the marriage. Now, when this feast happened, apparently in the Philistine law, they were married, but in Israeli law, they were not. So this feast went on for 7 days. And then Samson gave this riddle, which was not an uncommon thing apparently to do, to give riddles or to give some ideas of questions when they were at these feasts. So he gave this riddle to them, and he said to them, "Let me pose a riddle to you. If you can correctly solve and explain it to me within the 7 days of the feast, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. But if you cannot explain it to me, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing." This was a wager. And they said, "Let us have your riddle, that we may hear it." So, this riddle was how Samson was apparently supposed to ingratiate himself to these people. Now, it's interesting to know that Samson was given the job, so to speak, or given the invite to help to start to lead his people, the Israelites, free from the Philistines. And if you look back at the other judges, you look at Ilrud and Gideon, when they wanted to get help, they blew trumpets, they blew ram's trumpets and organized the people to follow them. And Barak did the same thing. He invited and organized the northern tribes with the help of Deborah, who supported him and encouraged him to fight against the enemies. When Jephthah was there, the elders of Gilead went to him because of his fighting prowess and his achievements to lead them against their enemies, the Ammonites. But here's Samson. The first thing he does is pose a riddle. And he posed a riddle to these people at his feast. And they apparently could not solve it, because the riddle said this: out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. Now, if you think about it, it's not a difficult riddle to solve, but apparently the people who were there, not knowing all the background, could not solve it. For 3 days they could not explain the riddle. But it came to pass on the 7th day, when it got down to the end of the feast, that they said to Samson's wife, or wife-to-be, "You get your husband, you get your spouse, to tell you the riddle." And she used her female traits against Samson. She cried and she begged and she pleaded in order to get him to tell her the answer to the riddle. And after a number of days of this, he did. He told her what the riddle meant. And she immediately told her Philistine friends, who at the end of 7 days gave the riddle answer to Samson. Now, they had told his wife-to-be that if she did not do this, they would burn down her house. They would burn you and your father's house. Because they said, "Did you invite us here just so we would have to pay money, or it would cost us, so we'd have to give away what we own to this fellow?" They threatened her. And so she, instead of telling Samson this, went along with them, got the answer to the riddle, apparently gave it to them, and then they gave it to Samson. And this infuriated him to the point that he accused her that he said he did not tell it even to his father or mother. But when they explained it out to him, he said, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. He said, if you had not conspired with my wife, or with my bride-to-be, or with my girlfriend, however you want to consider her at this time, if you had not conspired with her, some people said if you had not bedded her, if you had not taken her to bed and had sex with her, she would not have explained it to you. You would not have known it, and you would not have been able to tell it to me. And this made him extremely angry to the point that he went down to a city in the Philistine area, Ashkelon, killed 30 people, took their clothes, and gave it to the other Philistine people at the party as payment of his debt to them. Then he went home to his own home with his parents. He apparently never consummated this marriage, so the bride's father gave him to his companion who had been the best man at the feast and at the apparent wedding. Now this is a rather straightforward story, but it shows a number of things. First of all, it shows the difficulty when people of two faiths intermarriage, try to get together, the cultures of one interfering with the cultures of another. It shows how people can be misconstrued, how people of one culture may side with the people of their own culture rather than with their so-called bride or bridegroom. It shows the treachery that can develop when you get this type of cultural problems intermingled. Obviously, she was more interested in helping her Philistine friends than cooperating with her husband. And it shows the trouble you get into when you first start to lie. When you lie to your parents about where you'd gotten the honey, when he lied to himself, when he lied to himself about the lust he had for this girl, when he fell in love and yet was not able to understand the differences in the cultures between the Philistines and himself. It also shows that even though Samson was disobedient to God, God still had it in his plan to use him for good. And it was, as he said initially, Samson's intent to help to start the freedom of the Israelites from the Philistines. So now Samson was so angry at the Philistines that he had actually started to do this by using superhuman strength. He had went into the Philistine town, obtained the garments that he was supposed to give to the people at the wedding by killing 30 Philistines. He was starting to eliminate God's enemies, even though he did not know he was doing it under God's direction. And it shows that God can sometimes use the backdoor approach, so to speak, to get what he wants accomplished done, even though we are, in essence, we are probably disobeying what he actually expects us to do. Would he have done it differently if Samson had not disavowed his Nazirite vows? If he had followed the Nazirite regulations, would it have been done differently? And would it have been done perhaps easier? We'll never know, but the chances are likely that it would have been. But even though Samson was going behind God's direction and doing things his way, God's plan and God's program was still being worked out in a way that was what God wanted. So even though Samson was disobeying God in what he had done, in his behavior, in his actions, he was still in essence doing what he was supposed to do under God's direction. So this is part of Samson's downfall. He had the first strike against him when he fell in love with this girl and disobeyed his parents, disobeyed the instructions not to go near a carcass, not to go through vineyards. His second strike is when he went to this drunken feast and made this wager, which he lost in a surreptitious way, and then killed Philistines in order to satisfy the degree of the wager. So you can see how Samson's life is sort of going astray from what it should have been. All his potential is being lost because of his actions, because of what he does against his inheritance and against the way he should have been living his life. How often this happens to us is hard to say, but it's not infrequent. So Samson now has 2 strikes against him. He has 2 strikes against his activities that he has been doing in breaking the vows that he was supposed to hold as a Nazirite. And now he has killed Philistines. He has went home, left his bride or bride-to-be, who now has been given to somebody else, and his whole life is somewhat in a turmoil. And we'll see how this plays even further when we get into chapter 15 in the next lesson. So hopefully you'll join me for it then, as we follow along the saga of Samson and his problems as he leads Israel out against the Philistines. Anyway, that's all for today. Bye for now. Hope to see you next week.